One of the things I've noticed is that when it comes to leadership and when it comes to people, it's not the people who are always right or the people who are the best at what they do. It's not the nicest people. Those aren't necessarily the people that I respect the most. The people that I respect the most are the ones that are willing to have an idea or a thought and be willing to change their mind when presented with additional information or when they sort of kind of realize they're making a misstep. I think one of the biggest causes of hardship when it comes to teams, people, projects, just anything you want to do, the reason why people have so many problems is because they will not change their mind. This can bleed into like social problems and like, problems with relationships when it becomes more important that, you stay in control or that what you say isn't changed, that your ideas are executed as you said they would be. If that becomes more important than doing what is sometimes the obvious right thing, if it becomes more important to be right than to go back and revise what you're doing, I think that's really when people talk about pride being sort of a sin or being really a problem. I think that's what they're talking about when people cannot bring themselves to make a change because that wasn't what they thought they should do. I often try to think in my head sort of what kind of person that is. In some ways, I am that kind of person. There are certain things I, choose not to compromise on. I always make those choices very carefully, or at least in sort of the sense that I will recognize that it's going to cause a problem. And I also try to keep myself open to the fact that if people or if the results that I'm getting, if everyone says I'm wrong, then I will choose to change because sometimes, it's okay to stick to your guns, but it's not okay to, drive off a cliff. So, bringing things back to like video games and genre and things like that, I focus primarily on first person immersive sim style video game. If people aren't responding to sort of the choices I made or to sort of the game that I'm building, correctly, I'm going to have to shift things and I'm going to have to, cater to my audience a little bit. I understand that there's sort of like two sides of this. On the one hand, you may not be reaching the audience you wanted, and so you have to be careful about tailoring, your game for an audience, especially if you have a very limited sort of sample size. An example of this would be with the original Deus Ex. Like with the sequel, they got a lot of feedback from people that didn't like the original game for various reasons. So they made changes, but what ended up happening was that they ended up changing things so that people who didn't like the game would like the game more, but the people who liked the game started liking it less. So they ended up with kind of an inferior sort of game. You do have this sort of problem where if you do focus too much on what exactly this narrow subset of people wants, yeah, they'll get exactly what they want, but if you make a game for, 10 people, try starting a company on that. I don't think those 10 people are going to give you, $100,000 each to make your game. You do need to sort of be a little bit aware of like what does a larger community want. I think especially if you're in the smaller circuit of like game jams or making games within a particular indie community, especially if it's like a local community, especially if you are doing games that are really good in, the showroom floor, for instance, that's a very different environment than maybe the game you're trying to make. It's really, really kind of hard to show off, certain types of strategy games or certain types of games that are just longer forms of play in a showroom floor when you may only be able to give someone 5 minutes with your game. So when you're building that audience, you want to be trying to make sure that you're connecting with the people who are most interested in the type of game that you're making. And once you've sort of identified sort of your audience, that is when you can really start to say, are things resonating or are things not resonating? Another thing you can sort of talk about as well is like, do you have metrics or do you have like numbers derived by tracking what people are doing in the game to make your changes? Because those numbers, people can't lie about those as easily. And that's not to say that people lie intentionally, but it means that they will, misremember things or not perceive something the way it actually happened. I do kind of want to come back to that, the misremembering and the imperfect perception people may have. Like, those are important qualities as well because, those are, I guess I would say, like, their real feelings. That's what they remembered when they weren't playing a game. So you have to be kind of aware of what's going on there. So when people say the game isn't fun, it's kind of one of those useless statements What you can really then start to see is like, why are they kind of coming to this conclusion? What are the things they're saying? What are the things they might be expecting that aren't happening? Is there something common in all of these gameplay experiences? Stuff like that. So making changes when you have some feedback involved and you're fairly confident that these are the correct changes to be making, I think you're in a very good spot to make a change. And I think when it comes back to like the just generally in life and management and stuff like that, if you want to change something, you do want to be kind of thinking about, first of all, what's my environment? And, are the people telling me to, that think I should change or telling me to change, do those people matter? Especially in a social situation, if you don't change based on people around you, you're kind of communicating back to them that their opinion doesn't matter to you. For some people, they will say, well, if your opinion doesn't matter to you, or if I can't have any sort of influence on what you're going to do, maybe I don't want to be around you at all. And I understand some people just don't like being controlled. I hate that too. But the other side of that is some people just don't want to be around people that they are going to see making the same mistakes they did, or pushing people away because they need to have things done their way. I know some people just are prideful and don't want to change their mind. But my sort of thought too is that there's kind of different ways people change their mind. I think probably the most common one, the people just like dig in their heels. They don't change their mind. But it's not that they're not going to change their mind, it's that they're not going to change their mind at that moment. But over time, when they can have some space and perspective, then they can make a change. And it may, be a situation they just aren't used to getting a certain feedback from a certain type of person. And so they won't make that change in that moment. And they kind of have to have that space to kind of maybe talk to someone else about it and be like, hey, like, this person got up in my face about this thing and what was up with that. And then maybe the other person, kind of talks them through it a little bit more and maybe makes them realize, like, well, you might not want to listen to this one-off guy. But, and, I'm kind of saying when it comes to video games and your players, don't listen to these one-off players or the people that don't like your stuff. Having something that can kind of come in and kind of be a little bit of a reality check for you and be like, well, maybe you are doing something stupid and you should make some changes. I guess what I'm trying to say is if someone has dug in their heels, 6 months ago on an issue, that doesn't mean they're gonna dig in their heels on that issue 6 months later or a year later or whatever. So I guess what I'd say is, it's worth reaching back out to people, if they weren't feeling it the first time. I feel like it's kind of there's been a situation where like to really want to like cut off like a video game audience in a sense, I think that's kind of a very dangerous thing. But when it comes to video games like that, there's going to be some times when you're just going to have to admit that there's certain audiences you will not cater to. But you want to make those choices carefully and deliberately, and definitely not immediately. When it comes to people changing their mind, it's great when people can see and understand and they can do that quickly. But it's still okay if they can do that with a little bit of time. It's better when it takes less time, And if they ever actually apologize to you, it's a real like testament of character when someone, especially when they don't need to apologize to you, they take the time to say, "I'm sorry." That's when you got a real one. And maybe you should change your mind a little more with those people because you want to keep them around.